What happens when a humble waiter takes on a billionaire CEO? Watch as one man's fight for justice exposes a corrupt empire and changes everything. You won't believe the shocking twist that follows. Drop your city name below in comments if you tuned in. Don't miss out what hop on next. Let's dive in. The glittering ballroom of the Langston Enterprises gala was alive with laughter, the clink of glasses, and the hum of high society. The air was thick with the scent of luxury crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow, while elegantly dressed guests mingled and networked, their faces lit with the promise of power and influence. Among them, however, was one figure who stood out for entirely different reasons. Marcus, a young black waiter, was dressed in his crisp uniform, his hands moving deftly between tables, serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres with an air of professionalism that couldn't be ignored. But despite his perfect poise and the immaculate presentation, Marcus was invisible to most of the attendees. To them, he was nothing more than background, an unimportant player in the extravagant drama of the rich and powerful. His role at the event was simple: serve, smile, and disappear. However, what none of them knew was that Marcus had been watching, observing the way the elite interacted, how they spoke, how they dismissed people like him with a flick of their fingers. That night, Marcus felt something stir inside him, an ember that he hadn't noticed before. He wasn't just a waiter, he was a participant in a world that constantly looked down on him. Then Richard Langston, the CEO and host of the evening, stepped into the spotlight. He was everything the crowd adored: handsome, confident, and dripping with wealth. The very picture of success. But tonight, Richard wasn't merely the host, he was the king of the night, striding with that insufferable air of superiority that only those with money and power could afford. As he scanned the room, his eyes landed on Marcus, who was quietly replenishing drinks. A wicked smile crept across Richard's face as an idea formed in his mind. What better way to assert his dominance over the help than by humiliating him in front of the guests? "Marcus," Richard called out loudly, his voice carrying across the room. A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned toward him. "Tell me, do you even understand what's going on in this room? Or are you just here to serve?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus stood still, his back straight, his composure unshaken. He was no stranger to mockery, but this was different. This was a direct challenge from someone who believed their wealth made them untouchable. Marcus, calm and unfazed, stepped forward to face Richard without hesitation. He spoke, his voice steady but piercing. "I understand more than you think," he said, not backing down from the challenge. Richard's smile faltered, and a look of amusement flickered in his eyes. "Oh, really?" he scoffed. "Then tell me this, Marcus," he said, switching to French. "Je suis la roidc monde." The crowd fell silent, awaiting Marcus's reaction. Richard's smirk was self-assured. He had just asked Marcus to translate a phrase in a language he assumed Marcus would never understand. The gauntlet was thrown, and the humiliation seemed inevitable. Richard leaned in, expecting nothing more than an awkward silence. But Marcus didn't hesitate. He raised his chin slightly, his eyes narrowing in determination. "You just said, 'I am the king of this world,'" Marcus replied, his accent flawless and the translation perfect. A ripple of shock went through the room. Richard's smirk faltered for a moment, then his eyes narrowed in disbelief. The crowd, once filled with laughter, was now silent, their gazes fixed on Marcus. "And in this world," Marcus continued, his voice cutting through the tension, "true kings don't belittle others to elevate themselves." The weight of Marcus's words landed in the room like a thunderclap. Richard, clearly taken aback, stood frozen for a brief moment. The crowd had expected Marcus to cower, to stumble through an answer, but instead he had delivered a message of respect and dignity that could not be ignored. Richard laughed, though it lacked any real warmth. "Impressive," he said, his tone begrudgingly respectful, "but don't forget your place." Marcus stood tall, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "I know my place," he said simply, "and it's not beneath anyone." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, his head held high. The room, once filled with mocking whispers, was now charged with a new energy. Richard Langston's public jab had backfired, and Marcus had just proven that strength wasn't found in wealth or status, it was found in standing up for yourself, no matter who was watching. The guests watched in stunned silence as Marcus disappeared into the crowd, his dignity intact. The whispers that followed weren't of ridicule but of admiration. Marcus had just shown them all the true meaning of power by refusing to be reduced to nothing more than a servant. The next day, the air in Marcus's small apartment was thick with contemplation. The events of the previous night were still fresh in his mind. He had never anticipated a confrontation like that. Richard Langston, the embodiment of wealth and power, had tried to humiliate him in front of the most influential people in the city. But Marcus had turned the tables with just a few words. He had earned their respect, but now, it seemed that respect came with a price. Marcus had expected the night to pass as another job, another gala where he was nothing more than the invisible servant, but something had shifted within him. Richard had tested him, and in doing so Marcus had unknowingly tested himself. He had stood his ground, refused to be intimidated, and had proven that intelligence and self-respect were far more valuable than any title or paycheck. The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was from Richard Langston himself. The voice on the other end was unmistakably Richard's, but there was no sneer, no arrogance this time. There was only a sharp, direct tone. "Marcus," Richard began, "I've been thinking about our encounter last night. You impressed me." Marcus's mind raced. He wasn't sure if he should feel honored or cautious. He had no interest in playing Richard's games, but there was a curiosity gnawing at him. Why had Richard called? What did he want from him? "I was too quick to dismiss you," Richard continued. "You have potential. I think you could be an asset to my company." Marcus. There it was, the offer he had been waiting for, the invitation that would either make or break him. This wasn't just a job offer. Richard Langston wasn't asking him to simply serve anymore. He was offering him a seat at the table. Marcus stayed silent for a moment, allowing the weight of the words to settle. "What exactly are you offering?" "Me," he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. "Your loyalty, your insight, and your intelligence," Richard replied. "I have a project that could make you indispensable. I'll give you a taste of power, Marcus, but you'll need to choose. If you accept, you're no longer just a waiter, you're a part of something bigger." Marcus could feel the pull of temptation, the allure of wealth and influence, but he knew better than to be swayed by the promise of riches alone. He wasn't like Richard, driven by greed and ambition at any cost. "I'll think about it," Marcus said, his voice calm, but his mind already at work. Richard's words echoed in his ears. "You're not just a servant anymore." But Marcus was no fool. He wouldn't sell his soul for a position at the table of corruption and greed. Whatever decision he made, it would come with consequences, but he was ready to face them. Marcus had something Richard would never have: integrity, and that was a power far greater than any empire Richard Langston could build. As he ended the call, Marcus knew one thing for sure: he was no longer playing the role of the invisible servant. He had just stepped into a game where the stakes were much higher. Weeks passed since Marcus received Richard's offer, and although the temptation of power was strong, Marcus remained guarded. He continued his work at Langston Enterprises, observing, learning, and quietly positioning himself to understand what lay beneath the glossy exterior of Richard Langston's empire. Marcus wasn't just playing the part of an employee anymore. He was playing the part of a spy, gathering pieces to a puzzle he hadn't fully pieced together yet. The more Marcus learned, the more disillusioned he became. What had appeared as an opportunity to rise above his station, to perhaps work alongside the powerful elite, was slowly revealing itself to be an empire built on lies, manipulation, and exploitation. Marcus discovered that Richard wasn't just rich, he was ruthless. Langston Enterprises was deeply entrenched in unethical practices, from shady business deals to exploiting vulnerable communities for profit. The company's so-called philanthropic efforts were just a facade to distract from its more sinister operations. Late one night, while working in the office after hours, Marcus stumbled upon a file buried deep within the company's encrypted database. It was a detailed report of Langston Enterprises' financial activities, and what Marcus uncovered made his blood run cold. Richard had been funneling money into off-the-books accounts and laundering it through shell companies and foreign tax havens. The most shocking revelation, however, was the involvement of Langston Enterprises in forced labor operations in developing countries, exploiting workers to maximize profits under the guise of global outreach. As Marcus scrolled through the file, each new page revealed more damning evidence. Richard's empire wasn't just built on manipulation, it was built on the backs of the desperate and the powerless. His wealth was the product of human suffering, and the truth of it was now in Marcus's hands. Marcus sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, his mind racing. He couldn't let this go. He had to expose the truth, but doing so would come with unimaginable risks. This wasn't just a business corruption case. This was a matter of life and death for those being exploited. If he remained silent, he'd be complicit in the suffering of countless people around the world. He knew what he had to do. Marcus immediately contacted a trusted journalist, Sarah Mitchell, who had been known for taking down corporate giants. He couldn't do this alone, but with Sarah's help, they could bring Richard Langston and his empire to its knees. "I've got something that could bring Langston Enterprises down," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I need your help to expose it." Sarah's response was immediate. "Send me the documents. We'll make this public, and we'll make sure the world knows what Richard Langston has been hiding." The decision was made. Marcus knew the journey ahead would be treacherous, but the truth had to be told. Richard Langston's empire might be powerful, but Marcus had something far more dangerous in his possession: truth, and the unwavering determination to make it known. The fight for justice was about to begin. The moment Marcus and Sarah leaked the explosive details about Langston Enterprises to the press, the city was sent into a frenzy. The story quickly spread across news outlets, social media platforms, and public forums, drawing massive attention. Headlines screamed of corruption, forced labor, and the manipulation of vulnerable populations, all under the guise of a business, the empire that once seemed untouchable. The truth had finally come to light, and the fallout was immediate. Richard Langston, who had spent years building his legacy of wealth and influence, now found himself at the center of an unprecedented scandal. Langston Enterprises, once a titan in the business world, was crumbling. Protests erupted outside their headquarters, demanding accountability for the lives destroyed by their greed. Workers and families who had suffered in silence now had a voice, and they weren't going to let Richard's empire go unpunished. The once composed CEO was no longer the confident, untouchable figure he once was. Behind closed doors, Richard was a storm of fury. He paced his lavish office, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had someone he considered insignificant to expose the darkest parts of his empire? He had underestimated Marcus, and now the young man had cost him everything. Richard's anger morphed into a chilling resolve. He wasn't going to let this go. He knew that if he let this scandal unfold unchecked, it would be the end of him, his power, his wealth, everything he had worked for. He needed to regain control. It was in the midst of this chaos that Marcus received a call. It was from Richard. "You did this, Marcus," Richard hissed through the phone, his voice laced with venom. "You think you've won? This is far from over." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline at the sound of Richard's voice, but there was no fear, only clarity. This wasn't just about business or revenge. It was about justice for the people that had been silenced for too long. "I didn't do this to win," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I did this to expose the truth. What you built wasn't just an empire, it was a web of lies, and the world deserves to know." There was a long, tense silence on the other end of the line. Richard finally spoke, his voice colder than ever. "This won't end like you think it will, Marcus. I'll make sure of it." Marcus knew the battle wasn't over, but he also knew that he had already won. The truth was out, and no amount of power or threats could silence it. The fight had moved beyond corporate corruption, had become a fight for justice, for the forgotten and the oppressed, and Marcus had become the face of that fight. As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a sense of resolve settle in his chest. There would be no going back. He had exposed Richard Langston's empire for what it truly was, and now, there was no turning off the momentum. The world had seen the darkness, and they wouldn't be able to unsee it. Marcus was ready for whatever came next, but this time, he wasn't just standing in the shadows. He was leading the charge. Weeks passed, but the fallout from the scandal continued to shake the foundations of New York's elite. Langston Enterprises, once a symbol of unchallenged power, was now under relentless investigation. Law enforcement agencies, journalists, and advocacy groups flooded the company's headquarters, tearing apart its secrets. Richard Langston, once revered as a titan of industry, was now facing criminal charges, his empire crumbling faster than he could keep up with the mounting accusations. Meanwhile, Marcus watched it all unfold from the safety of his new life. He had stepped away from the chaos and returned to the quiet he once knew. His actions had sparked a movement, a collective rise against the powerful few who thought they could control the many. He had become a symbol of justice, not just for himself but for all those who had been silenced and exploited by corporate greed. But it wasn't just the outside world that had changed. Marcus had changed too. The young waiter who had once served in the shadows was now a powerful figure in his own right. He'd traded in his apron for a suit, his position at the back of the room replaced by a front row seat at the table of change. A non-profit organization dedicated to exposing corporate corruption had taken him in, making him one of their lead consultants. It wasn't wealth that had propelled him forward, it was the trust he had earned, the respect he had demanded. And now, he was using his voice to give a platform to the voiceless. Despite the recognition, Marcus remained humble. He knew the fight was far from over. Richard Langston's downfall had been a victory, but there were countless other corrupt leaders and systems to dismantle. Marcus wasn't naive enough to think this would be his only battle. He understood now that true power was not just in taking down the powerful, it was in building something stronger, something that could withstand the test of time. One evening, as Marcus stood on the balcony of his new apartment, looking out over the city, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the skyline. The world felt different, brighter. Even the sense of oppression that once hung heavy over his life had lifted. He had fought not for revenge but for something much bigger, justice, and in doing so he had found something far more precious than wealth or power. He had found his purpose. The phone rang, snapping him from his thoughts. It was Sarah, his trusted ally in this fight. "We did it, Marcus," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Langston is finished. The world has finally seen the truth." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. "It's just the beginning, Sarah," he replied, his voice resolute. "We've opened the door. Now we walk through it." He turned back to the view, watching as the city continued to hum with life below. There was still so much work to do, so many wrongs to right, but Marcus was ready. He had proven that one person could make a difference, that integrity and courage could topple the mighty. And with that, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. And just like that, Marcus proved that even the quietest voice can echo the loudest. From a humble waiter to a champion for justice, his journey reminds us all that the truth will always come to light no matter the cost. If you found this story inspiring, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like and share. Drop the name of your city below into comments. Stay tuned for more stories of courage, determination, and the fight for what's right. Because the truth is powerful, and together we can make a difference.